Can the Department of Governmental Efficiency under Trump actually get something done? And more importantly, can we avoid the looming economic disaster that is coming? Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Chris Martinson of Peak Prosperity. We're going to answer and address those questions today. And in particular, this is getting quite urgent when we look at the base data for where we are economically, financially, monetarily. We have to ask this question. Of course, it centers on this particular chart right here, which is the staggering pace of new debt accumulation by the U.S. government. This is an astonishing chart. It's now at 36 trillion. This is an old chart. You have to update these things every 100 days to sort of keep up with the trillions. But back when this chart was put together a few months ago, it noted that it took 220 years from the founding of the country for it to achieve its first 11 trillion in debt, and that 11 trillion in debt had been added since 2020. Now 12 trillion in debt since 2020. So in 4 years, 12 trillion. Now, where did that come from? And what can we do about it? Trump has said that he wants to implement something called the Department of Governmental Efficiency, Doge. There's your Shiba Inu down there representing Doge. And just today, he said that he's asked William Joseph McKinley to serve as counsel to the Department of Governmental Efficiency. Okay, and its job there is to provide guidance and the bloated federal bureaucracy. So the idea here is that money can be saved. Now, what is Doge going to try to do, and can it do it? Well, when I threw that question at Grok, it answered it this way. It said, within the first year, Doge aims to cut $500 billion in annual federal spending. I'm going to show where I think that can be taken right away, because that amount of money has been used to inappropriately, illegally spy on U.S. citizens. But hang with me for a minute. I'll see if I can make that case. They plan to deregulate using the Supreme Court ruling in the Chevron deference, which just says, hey, you know what? Federal agencies can't just sort of make laws, make rules that act like laws. Good idea. Agency reductions. Hey, maybe the Department of Education, a Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is anything but public. It's very slanted. Maybe parts of the IRS, all ideas on the table. Workplace policy changes to maybe end remote work for federal employees and voluntary terminations, reducing federal workforce size, things like that. And then most importantly, like all good efforts in life, it will be temporary in nature. Doge expected to end operations on July 4th, 2026. So this next calendar year being 2025, they basically have about a year and a half to get everything done. Can they do it? Now, what's interesting is, Jake Sherman here reporting that a senior Republican aide went to one of the Doge meetings and said, quote, two people, that would be Elon and Vivek, two people who know nothing about how the government works, pretending they can cut $1 trillion, both with decent pulpits to preach from in the ear of an unpredictable president. Disaster. The only good thing is that at some point they'll overpromise and get bounced by Trump, but until then, disaster. So the blob, a blobster is saying can't be done. Just can't be done. Oh, you're going to cut $1 trillion. That's impossible. How could you possibly do that? Oh, seems pretty easy to me, because to cut $500 billion means that somehow you'd have to find a way to rewind government expenditures to where they were in the Q3 of 2023. Just a year ago, they were $500 billion left. Could we possibly survive as a nation spending as much as we did last year? According to the blobster, can't be done. Disaster, complete disaster. I will also note that two things on this chart. This is total government expenditures at $7 trillion and $53 billion. First, that big spike you see right down there, that big echocardiogram spike, that's your inflation right there. Those were the PPP loans handed out, taken by people like in Congress, and not paid back. There's your COVID expenditure, your emergency, but it was a temporary emergency. And as Thomas Sowell said, there is nothing quite so permanent as a temporary government program. Well, that temporary emergency became a permanent emergency, and let me get my laser pointer tool up. Now you can see This green dotted line would be if the government had only been growing its operations at the normal historical pace. All this is extra fluff up here. And that's, by the way, these are $1 trillion increments from here to here. So that's almost $2 trillion extra dollars of stuff that the government has now permanently, temporarily put into place. This is the great financial crisis. You can see there was a great crisis, some spending, a little extra spending, but it came back down to trend line. What Mr. Can't Be Done up here, a senior Republican aide, is saying, oh no, we could never get back down to this green trend line, which would just be getting government growth back to an already terrible trajectory. I think we could do better than that. Now, but the question is, well, where exactly do you cut it? Because it turns out most of the government spending is on entitlements, non-defense, considering defense to be the part of discretionary you can't really touch. Non-defense discretionary spending is a fairly minor amount of the overall expenditure. So I got this from the Treasury.gov, the Treasury Department, looking at here. This is at the fiscal year 2024, and the fiscal year of the U.S. government goes from September 30th to September 30th. So through fiscal year 2024, which ended on September 30th, 2024, just a couple months ago, we see that total receipts were $4.919 billion, and that's a lot. Individual income taxes at 4.919 trillion, 4,919 billion. So 2.4 trillion of that was individual income taxes. Another 1.7 trillion came from social insurance and retirement, FICA taxes, which you pay half, the corporations that you work for, the company you work for pays half. Then corporate taxes lagging along here at only 530 billion because, of course, they really just want to soak the workers, not capital. That's the labor versus capital. Labor lost that battle a long time ago. And then we have excise taxes, customs duties, miscellaneous estate and gift taxes, just mouse nuts. But a total deficit of 1.83 trillion they reported because outlays were 6.7 trillion, now at a run rate of 7 point something trillion, of which Social Security, can't really touch that. Health, hard to touch. Net interest, can't do anything about paying your interest payments, otherwise you default. Medicare, hard to touch. National defense, well, people are going to really complain about that because national defense is really international offense, and it's really congressional make-work programs in districts carefully sprinkled all across the country in congressional and Senate districts by the so-called defense companies out there. They do that. They play good defense for their defense by sprinkling the money around. So nobody wants to cut that. Income security, hard to cut that. So then veterans benefits, that's going to be tricky. Education, sure. Transportation, it's hard to cut transportation. I mean, our bridges are already falling down. And other at 311 billion. By the way, the size of that line is not reflective of the size. It should be as fat as these lines in here, pretty much, somewhere between the thickness of those two. So that one didn't get drawn right. But the question is, well, where does this actually get cut from? Well, I actually am going to report here right now that this reported deficit of 1.83 trillion, by the way, the trend ain't your friend in this case. You can see this is just going this way. And we're going to have permanent $2 trillion deficits for a very long time at a minimum. But the reported deficit of 1.83 trillion is a fiction because that's what they reported. You have income and you have expenditures. Income and expenditures. You subtract one from the other and you end up with a deficit of $1.83 trillion, which is what they reported here. The problem is that we can easily calculate by going to a different part of the Treasury website that between this calendar year of 9/29/23 and 9/30/2024, total outstanding public debt increased by $2.3 trillion. When they reported a deficit of $1.83 trillion, $464 billion is missing. Well, where is it? Because if the debt went up, the debt goes up because the U.S. government spends more than it takes in and it has to issue debt, treasury notes, puts them out to auction. It gets cash. That's the actual deficit. The actual deficit was 2.3 trillion, not 1.8 trillion. So where's the missing 464 billion? Where did all that cabbage go? Stick with me for a second. I have a short story to tell here. Are you tired of feeling run down, maybe low energy? You know you've got some pounds you'd like to lose. Maybe you've got brain fog or something like that. Listen, we think we have the answer to all of that, and it begins with your food. If you're like me, you were shocked to hear testimony recently that unraveled and unearthed and exposed the idea that our food has been made addictive by addiction specialist scientists, the tobacco scientists out there putting things in our food. Maybe it also shocked you to discover that Europe does not allow all kinds of stuff in our food because they know it's toxic. What is the combined effect of all of this? Listen, we know what the data is. It's horrifying. The number of children showing up with type 2 diabetes, the total metabolic disasters unfolding across the land, marked by obesity, sure, but we have cardiovascular issues, concomitant rises in cancers, all of these things, and it all starts with food. Garbage in, garbage out. So what do we do about that? First, it begins with understanding the context. We've put together a very exciting, comprehensive food webinar that will expose the regulatory side of this and what is being done and why and how this happened to us. We'll be talking with Thomas Massey about that. We've got Dr. Ken Berry talking with us on the practitioner side and the solution side. We've got Tracy Thurman talking to us about the war on farmers and the war on food that has been happening. And Robert Barnes to help us to understand that as well. Many, many other guests to both define what the problem is and what we can do about it. And we want to make it as simple as possible. Here's an example. Tortillas. Hey, maybe you're even on keto and these are carb-wise. So these have low amounts of carbs. See that? Carb-wise. Yeah, these are carb-wise. So keto-friendly. I want to note something. You see how fresh these look? Yeah, you see any mold in there? Any bacteria, any yeast, any sign of anything, any organism in there? These things expired in June and it is now November. So, what are they putting in our food that even black mold won't eat it? I don't know, but I've decided that if it's not good enough for black mold, it's no longer good enough for me. Once you start down that path, you realize that we have got sugar and preservatives and salt and seed oils, all of the chemicals that are unnecessary, and the fact that the food pyramid is absolutely wrong. So if you like effective information that leads to effective action, this webinar is for you. It's going to be the usual thing that my team and I will put on. It'll be organized, digestible, easily understandable, and most importantly, it's going to be actionable in ways that you will understand what to do. And I've designed it so that you would easily be able to send this to anybody that you love or care about, say, can we talk about this, and have it as a starting point for conversation. But what we really want, we want you to be healthy because, well, who doesn't want to be healthy? Health is the number one form of personal capital you can have, of course. But given everything that's going on in the world, being healthy and vigorous and active are going to be dominant strategies and things you're really going to want to be carrying in. So folks, it's time to get prepared on all levels. It begins here. It starts at home. It begins with our eating. And let's just make sure that we're not eating stuff that even black mold won't touch. With that, thank you very much for listening, and we'll get back to our regular programming now. Bye-bye. Matt Taibbi reported on this back in January of 2019 that there was a little-known government body called the Federal Accounting Standards Board, FASB, or FASAB Advisory Board, FASAB, and they put out this guidance, SFAS 56, SFAS 56, Classified Activities. It's a standard. The government said, we're going to pass a new standard for ourselves. And that standard permitted government agencies to modify public financial statements and move expenditures from one line item to another. It also expressly allows federal agencies to refrain from telling taxpayers if and when public financial statements have been altered. Now, according to Michigan State Professor Mark Skidmore, this is a shock. From this point forward, he says the federal government will keep two sets of books. One modified book for the public and one true book that is hidden. I would submit to you that we can see that true book. That's the actual debt. The reported deficit versus the increase in debt, I'm going to go with the increase in actual debt because that's a market number right there. This is not reported. This is how much is standing out there. The auctions are public. Everybody gets to see them. The government can't like actually auction 2.3 trillion, but tell the world it only auctioned 1.8 trillion. That don't work. So it actually increased total outstanding debt by $2.3 trillion. Okay. Now, what's interesting is who has the right? Who can actually modify the books? Who has that power inside the federal government? Any guesses? Interestingly enough, it was under GWB, George Bush assigned this duty to the Director of National Intelligence. Oops, sorry, that got cut off up there. In 2006, memorandum for the Director of National Intelligence, I hereby assign to you the function of the President under Section 13B3A of the SEC Act of 1934, as amended by 15 U.S.C. 17M B3A. Oh, so the Director of National Intelligence can tell companies that they can cook the books? Now, who was the Director of National Intelligence starting under COVID, and what were they up to? Oh, that's right. That was Avril Haines participating here in Event 201, right? Which war-gamed out very, very presciently, we should say, very coincidentally, that the world had never had a coronavirus pandemic before, but Event 201 in October of 2019 actually war-gamed out a coronavirus. And you know what they actually war-gamed out there? She is talking with George Gao, who's the equivalent of the CDC director of China. What they war-gamed out was, how do we control what people think? How do we control the media? How do we make sure people don't become vaccine hesitant? How do we actually get people to take a vaccine, which may be crushed through a regulatory process that isn't so complete? Basically, it was how do we go about controlling the populations of the world in order for them to just do what we tell them to do. They didn't so much focus on how do they save lives, and that wasn't one of their metrics that they were gearing towards. It was really how do we work hand in glove with corporations to get what we need done? Pharma corporations, media corporations, social media companies. That was what Event 201 was really about. Of course, hosted at Johns Hopkins, which is ground zero for this stuff. Center for Health Security, they say. Yeah, has nothing to do with health. Okay, this is what's interesting. So it turns out with this passage of FASAB 56, what this means to you as an investor in commercial real estate conversations, I thought that Ian Bertolina posted an interesting observation here. Again, in 2019, said, guess what? This resolution, FASAB 56, quote, allows companies to alter and misrepresent their financial statements if it's deemed to be in the interest of national security. In addition, the resolution allows companies to maintain secrecy to the general public about ever having misrepresented their financial statements, too. You'd think that it's such a dire thing to have companies begin to misrepresent their financial statements. You would not just sort of enter into that sort of for no reason whatsoever. But I think that's exactly what's happened here. Because, we have all this missing money. And I'm going to show you that it's actually $1 trillion that's been missing over the past 3 years. But $464 billion just in the past reporting year. We see here in fourth quarter of 2023, the earnings per share revisions of the Magnificent Seven, right? You see them down there, right? Facebook and Apple and Amazon and Netflix, Google, Nvidia, Tesla, etc., right? So you see them, they actually had positive earnings surprises, whereas the entire rest of the S&P 500, which would be 500 minus 7, so the S&P 493 had minus 15% overall earnings revisions. How did just these 7 companies do so much better? Well, what's kind of interesting is that, and let me just go full screen here. Well, I guess censorship isn't cheap. That's what I'm guessing right here. So we know the government was hiding money in FASAB 56. We don't know how much. We're guessing $464 billion for the past year. I would advise and invite Doge to take a good hard look at that, because I don't think Americans ought to be paying for their own censorship. It just doesn't feel right to me on any level whatsoever. So the government over here, if they are passing money out, it could go to foundations who could then hide where that money came from. It could go to for-profit companies. It could go to academic initiatives down here, like all that stuff that happened at Stanford and CIDRAP and all that other junk. It could go to think tanks. It could go to fact checkers down here, the whole Pointer and all those other CADs and absolutely just losers, profound losers. All you fact checkers are losers. And I will continue to say that until you're out of business. NGOs, and of course, big tech. So the question is, well, how much went there? Inquiring minds would like to know. It wasn't zero. I can't guarantee it was all 464 billion, but it was a number. Now, in part 2 of this for my subscribers at Peak Prosperity, because this is my big Friday content, I got a huge piece. We got to talk about the super cycle bubbles destructive end. And I'm going to relate this back to, we're going back to first principles again, because this is what I do. Energy. We have to look at this through the energy lens. And so I'm going to look at all these different bubbles we have in the energy end. And of course, we did this whole thing. You know, you have to exercise your muscles to be strong. You have to exercise your mind to keep it nimble and in the game. So no matter what, agree with me, disagree with me, all I ask is that people come and engage with their minds. And so I am the mental gymnasium for this kind of stuff. And again, agree, disagree. The important part is that you engage with it. All right. So here's the bad news. Again, this comes from the Treasury Department. And here I'm just looking at receipts and outlays. So that's either a deficit as a positive number or a surplus, weirdly, as a negative number, right? So receipts here in January of 22 were 465 billion, outlays were 346, surplus, weirdly, as a negative of minus 118 billion. Cool. But borrowing from the public during that same month was 340 billion. So this is when you add all of this up, it turns out that the U.S. government ran about $4 trillion of deficits. That's what was reported to us. Again, that's the public reporting, 4 trillion of deficits, but they borrowed 5 trillion. There's a whole trillion missing. So this is 3 years. This is 2022, 2023, 2024. Okay, four separate years. And by the way, 2024 isn't done yet. It only goes up through September. I started this on a calendar year. So that's January to January to January. And then this only comes up through September. So minimum 4 trillion of reported deficits over that period of time and 5 trillion of borrowing from the public. Now I wonder what that trillion went to. Inquiring minds would like to know. And by the way, we know that that 5 trillion went out the door because it led to federal debt that's exploding like this, now hitting $36 trillion. It's a parabolic. This is starting to go vertical. And that's an important thing. And then because that's the debt at 36 trillion, the interest payments on that debt are quite extraordinary. And now the interest payments are larger than even the bloated defense outlays, right? That's an astonishing thing that happened right there. Look at this enormous change that's happened here. This, by the way, friends, represents about $1 trillion a year. Actually, it's about 1.2 right now. $1.2 trillion a year that comes out of the government as interest payments and principally goes back to large financial participants who receive that as cash, who then put that back into the government or into the market. So if you've been wondering why the markets are frothy, why they're bubbly, this is basically stealth QE, quantitative easing. This is the equivalent of money printing because the government has to borrow more and then it pays more cash out. And the Federal Reserve is there to make sure that that whole thing stays well liquefied and that there are no hiccups in the system. And so sometimes the Federal Reserve prints money directly, and sometimes the government takes over that equivalent role, in this case by printing interest payments. This is huge. This is enormous. This is going from 500 billion to 1.2 trillion. That's like $600-700 billion of fresh cash being thrown into the markets, into the financial system every year, just to keep it going. Okay? That's astonishing. Now, 315 trillion in global debt, 100 trillion of that's in the US. So that means the United States is about 30 some odd percent, let's call it a third, of total global debt. We're not a third of the population. So that's why if you ever felt like a debt donkey, a tax donkey, if it ever felt like it's hard to kind of like, why can't we have nice things? It's because we're spending trillions on so-called defense. The rest of everybody sort of benefits from that. You know, we're the world's policemen, but we pay for the whole thing. Nobody else is given, nobody's given us a little taste of that. So United States, we are the tax donkeys, and we pay the most out of anybody for health care. We have the inarguably, we pay the most for education. If you want to go to college, we pay the most. We have the worst sort of infrastructure, bridges and high-speed trains. We don't even have any, right, compared to other nations who do spend their money on their own people. But this is coming to an end because you see what's happening here. This down here in red, get my laser pointer back. This is GDP, gross domestic product. That's the income in this story. So let's imagine this is a family. This is the family's income, and this is the family's credit card. Well, I think you can see what the problem here is. The credit card debt is growing twice as fast as their income is growing. That, my friends, is a math problem. Sooner or later, that breaks. Is it later now? Is later going to be later? We don't exactly know, but when it comes, it's going to happen fast. That's why I preach resilience and why I think we have to get our arms around this. And by the way, D.O.G.E. may or may not be able to really alter the dynamic of this a lot, because this is global. This is the total amount of debt in the U.S. system, not just federal debt. They can touch federal debt, but we still have all this other debt: corporate debt, municipal debt, state debt, household debt, etc. So all of those forms and sources of debt are $100 trillion and growing very rapidly. And this is post-COVID. It's just a huge debt explosion. Now, what is debt? Debt's a claim on future money. Debt is money borrowed from the future for spending today. It's future consumption pulled to today. We're living high on the hog today with the idea that we'll never have to live lower on the hog in the future. But that's it's axiomatic. Someday that comes. I'm predicting that day is actually going to be coming within the next 1 to 2 years. And I'll tell you why specifically in part 2. And it has to do with energy. Now, you can look at this and you can go, yeah, if that was a family, that doesn't work. And as a nation, it doesn't work. You know that. I know that. Turns out everybody knows that. Unsustainable. Cynthia Loomis asked Jerome Powell about that. Now he shouldn't actually have to respond to fiscal issues. He's a monetary guy, but see, she cornered him and said, hey, Jay, is debt a problem? And he said, well, no, but the problem is that we're on a path where the debt is growing substantially faster than the economy. And that by definition is, in the long run, unsustainable. That's what he was talking about. This chart, you can see it. I can see it. Jay can see it. We all see it. Everybody sees it, but it's not being talked about. Now, I didn't see either candidate talking about it in this last presidential cycle because it's kind of like, it's not a great, it's like, what are you going to do? Well, since nobody's talking about it, it's going to bite, it's going to hit. You need to be ready for that because it's going to impact you. In fact, it is already impacting people, and we already know this. We can see this in the rising levels of homelessness, the deaths from fentanyl overdoses, which are really deaths of despair because a lot of people are finding that they are locked out of this economy. As this debt problem gets worse and worse, here's the prediction. The people at the top don't feel it at all. The people at the very top actually do better because the Federal Reserve, under that guy right there, print the money and hand it to rich people, principally on Wall Street, private equity, financiers, rentier class people, people who perform tricks of financialization, which is the project of making money with money. They don't make widgets with money. That's risky and hard work, and you get grease under your fingernails. I mean, the financial types. Insurance, all that stuff, right? Just use money to make money. Now, although insurance has to deal with risk a little bit. But for the most part, this is the project that we've been undergoing, and you see the deaths of despair creeping up the ladder because as the economic oxygen gets harder and harder to find, and more of it ends up concentrated at the top, you just get this creeping thing where it used to be, just the bottom 10% of society was really struggling. And then it's the bottom 20% that's really struggling. I submit to you the bottom 50% is really struggling. And that's coming to a neighborhood near you. I don't care how far up that chain you are. We carry this project on long enough. We take this to its bitter conclusion, and everybody ends up immiserated. That means made poor. That's where we're going. That's why I do what I do. This doesn't have to be this way. We could totally change this. And I think D.O.G.E is a first step to say, hey, we got to rationalize this. Let's do what we can. The federal government's out of control. I showed you that expenditures, the spending, it's out of control. They had a temporary emergency, and they've now enshrined that as permanent extra spending that's adding $2 trillion of new debt every year to the national balance sheet. And there's no plan for how or when or why that's going to get reversed. It's just, it won't happen before my reelection comes up. That's why we got to get rid of almost all these clowns in Washington, nearly all of them. There's a couple I like. I like Senator Ron Johnson. I like Thomas Massie. There's a few I like. But by and large, most of them got to go. Just get them out of here. Really, they don't understand what the problems are. They just don't know. Now, so this is unsustainable. Again, a direct quote from Jerome Powell, which really should be talked about everywhere all the time, is the problem, he says, is that we're on a path where the debt is growing substantially faster than the economy. And that, by definition, in the long run, is unsustainable. This chart, it's a very simple chart. I pulled this off the Federal Reserve website. You put two lines on there. One called gross domestic product, the other all sectors, debts, securities, and loans. If you want to find that, the actual ticker symbol for that is the shorthand is TCMDO, Total Credit Market Debt Outstanding, TCMDO. All right. Herb Stein put it well a long time ago. He said, if something cannot go on forever, it'll stop. Well, what happens when things stop? Now, I was just talking about debt before, right? We have $100 trillion of debt in the U.S., $100 trillion. But that's not all we have. Your credit card debt is one thing you have, but if you have kids that are about to go to college and you haven't saved any money for that and they're going to college, you now have a liability, not a debt yet. Liabilities often turn into debts, but you have a liability. A liability is an outstanding obligation that you got to pay at some point in time. So when we look at those, Ray Dalio's Bridgewater reported this a number of years ago, and they updated it, I think in 2000. This is from 2019. I wish it was more current, but it doesn't matter. This is a chart. This is a complete disaster here. So you can see here we had the great financial crisis here. Things were sort of like getting bad, but then things really shot up. And what this chart means is that private debt is the thing we talked about. That's about 100 trillion right here. Okay. And well, actually it's about 70 trillion. And then you have about 30 trillion of government debt at the time this chart went up. Okay. Yeah, it would have been less than, it would have been maybe 25 and maybe 65, something like that at this time at 2019. And then in green, we have pension liabilities. These are liabilities that are unfunded, underfunded, that are owed by corporations. I think we just saw Kodak was trying to get rid of theirs, get theirs off their books and stick it to their pensioners. We have here other mandatory government, which is mandatory stuff the government's got to do. But then the biggies, we got Medicare and we got Social Security as these top two color wedges in this chart. And when you add it all up and you say the total amounts of these things as compared to GDP, that's as percent of GDP, we can see here the current projection is, well, we're right around 1,200% or 12 times GDP. Has a country ever dug itself out from a hole that deep? Nope, never has. It's never happened in history. So we're in all brand new uncharted territory, and somebody in power really ought to answer the question, like, how do we do this? Well, if we don't manage it in some way, and by the way, it'll be very unpopular. To really actually manage this, you're going to have to disappoint some people. You're going to have to say, okay, some of this private debt doesn't get paid back, or, hey, we're going to have to trim Social Security or Medicare. We're going to have to just dial those way back, or something's going to have to happen here. We're just going to have to give up on our pension liabilities. One way or the other, somebody's going to get disappointed. Now, when you see a chart like this, though, what you need to be thinking right away is, what is the answer to the one and only question? It's just one question. I look at this chart. I have one question that fires off into my head. And it's this. Who's going to eat the losses? There's no resolving this. There's no growing our way out of this. It just, the faster we grow, the faster this seems to grow. So it's not working. We're growing our way into a worse situation, not a better one. And that's because we have weak leadership. Remember, hard times create good men create easy times create weak men create hard times. Well, it's been easy for a long time. We have a lot of exceedingly weak leadership, and they've given us this. Because this is a harder conversation to have with people. It's like, well, yeah, we shouldn't have done that, but here we are. How do we want to resolve it? And there's only two ways to resolve this question of who's going to eat the losses. Now, the bankers are lobbying to make sure it's not them. It's a game of hot potato, right? And politicians are working hard to make sure it's not them. If you haven't seen my Great Taking series to understand what the mechanism might be for assigning these losses to the wrong parties, you should watch that, because the Great Taking articulates the underlying mechanism. David Rogers Webb wrote the book, and I expanded on that, interviewed him a couple times. And what that articulates is this idea that the legal machinery has been installed just in case there's a big sort of a need to settle the books, and they just want to make sure that the settling takes all of the productive assets of the United States, all the bonds and stocks, and make sure they all end up in the hands of the same people who made the mess. Now, if that feels unfair to you, that's because it is, of course. Now, here's a prediction. There is massive inflation coming, right? Because there's only two ways to get yourself out of this chart. One, inflation. Two, deflation. What do I mean by deflation? Deflation is, hey, China, we're just not going to pay you for all those treasury debts you have. Sorry, Japan, we're just not going to pay those. We're just going to cancel them. Your loss, our gain. That's deflation. In deflation, you just say, I can't pay my mortgage back to the bank, so I'm not going to pay it. The debt lands on the books of the bank as a hot potato, and it causes a lot of destruction to the bank earnings and capital structure, right? So in a deflationary scenario, people, countries, companies don't pay their debts back. And when you have that deflationary scenario, the holders of that debt, they're the losers. Well, when debts and IOUs cannot be paid back, they are discharged either via deflation, which hurts the rich people. That means the people who held the mortgage note, who own the treasury bond, pretty much the rich folks. They're the ones who take the losses. So guess what? That's very unpopular amongst the ruling classes. Or this is the only other path. You take the road of inflation. Guess what? That mostly hurts the poor. Inflation spread out across everybody, but it is the most regressive tax of all, because if hamburger goes from $5 to $10 a pound, well, now all of us have to pay the $10 a pound, Chris. Yeah, but the family that's struggling gets hurt a lot more than the family that wouldn't even notice. They don't notice if their food bill's $1,000 or $2,000 this week. They won't notice, right? It's irrelevant to their earning structure. So yes, everybody experienced inflation, but obviously it's a regressive tax, because inflation is a tax. Okay, inflation isn't like a meteor that we didn't predict coming across the skies. It's not some freak act of nature that we haven't figured out how to understand or predict. Inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. It's Milton Friedman said that. Inflation is an act of policy. Inflation is a tax. You have money that's worth X, but with inflation, it's worth X minus Y. Where'd that minus Y come from? It's a tax. It's the same as if the government reached into your bank account and took Y dollars out of it, right? So let's say you had $1,000 and Y is $200. Your $1,000 next year only buys $800 worth of stuff. Where'd your $200 go? It feels mysterious, like it have just evaporated into the ether, but it did not. That money was stolen. It was taxed. So I just want everybody to be very clear about this, and it's in child's play, therefore, for me to predict which path is going to be selected here. Hurt the rich and well-connected people, or shaft the poor? This is a no-brainer, obviously. Obviously, the rich people gave themselves vaccine exemptions, but made sure that they were mandated for everybody else. The rich people make sure that the laws and rules don't apply to them. They hand themselves pardons about things. They openly commit things that, crimes that aren't even investigated, yada, yada. Same old story, same old story. If this surprises you in the slightest, wow. Hi, Rip Van Winkle. Glad to have you on my show. Where you been? Nobody should be surprised by this, right? So given a choice between harming the poor and dinging the perceived portfolio values of the rich, they're going to choose harming the poor. Because we have to understand, banking is not, I know Jerome Powell looks like a kindly guy, and Janet Yellen had this grandmotherly act and all that. It's an act. Not a nice lady whatsoever. Not a nice guy. They have this thing where it looks like they're trying to do the right thing for everybody, but they're not. They are invariably doing the right thing for the banks. I get it. They're a cartel. They have clients. Their clients aren't you and me. We don't vote them into office. There's nothing I can say that could make them feel ashamed or contrite. I have no power over them. Their clients are the people who hold their capital stock, and the capital stock of the central bank of the United States is principally held 75%-ish, is held by just two other outside companies, Citibank and JP Morgan. The remaining dribs of 25% held across all the other thousands of banks in the country. So those are its prime clients, right? If you own 75% of me, you'd be my prime client. The prime clients of the central bank, the Federal Reserve of the United States, is JP Morgan and Citibank. Okay, given that, if the Federal Reserve has to come up with a decision that's either going to destroy the value of both of those two companies or shaft a whole lot of poor people, this is easy. This is humanity 101. This is just read the classics, read a little Shakespeare, a little Macbeth, maybe some Cicero. It doesn't matter. Go back in time and you'll find out that this is just how it works with humans. Okay. So that's what's going to happen. Now, collapse is a process, not an event. It's already begun, right? We can see that there are now 653,000 people that experienced homelessness. That sounds like a Disney ride or something. I don't know. Weird, but a 12% increase from 2022. 2024 is probably going to continue that process. This is that social erosion creeping up. And we're seeing now, it used to be homeless were mentally ill people who didn't have a mental institution to live in, and or people who had a severe drug problem or both. And now we're seeing more and more people who are in the homeless camps who are middle class, formerly what we'd call middle class, right? It's not hard to find a story of an adjunct professor living out of her car and showering in some public gym facility so she can go teach a class in some, college in California. That's that erosion. It's creeping up. Will the Federal Reserve care if they have to creep that all the way up the ladder? No, not until they won't care until it actually affects them. So all of this larger systemic stuff, this is exactly why we preach resilience at Peak Prosperity. Resilience is the ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. These are just big changes. There's system change coming. And that's why I talk about things at the system level. That's why I want to stretch your mind around these things, because it's important that you wrestle with them, even if it's only to say, Chris, you got this all wrong. Here's why. I love that. The point is, these things are happening and they're not being talked about, and they really need to be talked about at every level, but especially our level, because we're the ones that are going to have to live with the consequences of this, better or worse, right or wrong. So when you get down to like, well, what do I do? peakprosperity.com, we have a whole take action section. You can see the link down there. I want you to be resilient. I want you to get to a point where you have the capability of not being caught in the maelstrom and the anxiety and the fear that's going to come along for a lot of people who are unprepared for what's coming next. And most are unprepared. They are mentally unprepared, physically unprepared, spiritually, financially unprepared for what's coming. And let me back up. It's already here. It has already arrived. And it's going to continue to arrive like a tide coming in, moving its way into neighborhoods and up social strata as it comes. And we break this down into 4 forms of capital at Peak Prosperity: wealth, health, home, community. So if you are rich in each one of these 4 forms of capital, then you're going to be much more resilient than somebody who isn't. Or let's say you only have, you got a lot of wealth. I'm good. I have a lot of wealth. Chris, I got a ton of wealth. I'll be fine. None are so poor as those who only have money. The rest of these things require time, require skills, require social connections, require effort to get there, and money can't buy these things. They just take time. So imagine that you went into the wealth one and you clicked on the wealth link up here and you said, oh, I want to build financial capital. It would take you to a page that would look like this. Peak Financial Investing. We have financial advisors on board, who we work with, who understand this world we've just talked about, see it in this way. And I think you deserve, if you have money that needs to be managed or you'd like it to be managed, you deserve to talk with somebody who sees the world the same way you do and has your best interests at heart. Right? That's really important. For people who have the ability to have self-directed 401ks, the EQRP is just one of the best things I know about out there. I have one. It's a fantastic thing. And of course, I believe gold and silver form the basis of avoiding the inflationary and monetary outcomes and madnesses, respectively, that are about to hit the shores. I have sort of a Hippocratic oath around investing. It's a little bit defensive, but it's kind of, it's not, first do no harm is the Hippocratic oath. Mine is first take no irrecoverable losses, right? Don't have so much put into any one spot that if it all goes away, you're left with nothing, just, or too little, okay? But health, if you haven't got your health, you've got nothing at all. We want you to build physical and emotional and spiritual capital. You've heard me talk about, hey, plant a garden. If you watched any of my COVID reporting, I was kind of pushing on this for a variety of reasons, not least of which is going to be outlined in Food and the Great Awakening. We have a webinar coming up on January 10th. It's all about what's going on in the food system, how toxic it is. It's just shocking when you look into it, but there's lots you can do about it. But first, you have to understand what the dimension of that landscape is. So that's what we do at Peak Prosperity. We take fairly complicated things like this and synthesize it down so you save the time and have a really big head start on whatever project you're going to get underway with. But having your health, number one, get that. So with that, now I'm going to turn for my subscribers to this part, no recovery. We have to talk about the super cycle of these bubbles. Very destructive ending coming for these things. For everybody else, thank you so much for listening. Come by Peak Prosperity, please. Look at our Take Action section. You can click through that. We've got guides. I want you to be prepared. I want you to be resilient. I want you to be happy and healthy. I want your family to be prepared and protected. And I want you to be an asset to your community in a time of trouble when other people are going to be a net drain. You should be a net positive. This is from those who have much, much is expected. And I hope to be with you on this project as we begin the long process of rebuilding. But I do think we got a little darkness coming first, and it's around this idea that we are in a grand super cycle, financially speaking. We got a lot of bubbles all at once. So with that, thanks very much for listening. We'll see you next time. And I can't wait to see what your comments are to this. Bye for now.